The wind that crossed the Mongolian steppe in the late 13th century carried no memory of unity. It moved freely over grasslands that had once answered to a single will, passing ruined encampments, newly fortified cities, and the long, shallow graves of men who had believed the empire eternal. From the Black Sea to the Yellow Sea, the Mongol world still appeared vast, still inspired fear, yet beneath that scale lay fracture, rivalry, and the slow erosion of a political order built on conquest. This was the world into which Khutulun was born, a world where power was inherited but never secure, and where survival depended on strength sharpened by constant competition. By the time of her birth, the Mongol Empire no longer functioned as a unified dominion. The legacy of Genghis Khan had expanded beyond any single ruler's ability to command it. His descendants governed vast territories divided into khanates, each ruled by members of the same bloodline yet increasingly hostile to one another. The Ilkhanate controlled Persia, the Golden Horde dominated the western steppes, the Chagatai Khanate ruled Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty held China. These were not equal partners but rivals bound by ancestry rather than loyalty. Each claimed legitimacy through descent, and each measured authority through military strength rather than law. The memory of Genghis Khan still governed Mongol political imagination. His conquests had reshaped the known world, and his methods had established a culture where discipline, mobility, and violence were instruments of order. Yet his system relied on personal loyalty and continuous expansion. Without new territory to absorb ambition, rivalry turned inward. Succession disputes hardened into wars, alliances shifted without warning, and kinship became both shield and threat. To be born into the imperial family was to inherit not stability, but expectation and danger in equal measure. Women of royal blood occupied a defined yet demanding position within this system. Mongol culture granted women more autonomy than many sedentary societies, particularly in managing households, herds, and diplomacy during the absence of men. Elite women could influence politics through marriage alliances and regency, but their authority remained conditional. They were expected to preserve lineage, secure alliances, and embody continuity. Their value lay in stability, not disruption. Strength was admired, but only within boundaries that reinforced male dominance over warfare and command. Khutulun's lineage placed her close to the center of imperial conflict. She was born into the house of Khutulun Khan, a powerful descendant of Ogdi, the third son of Genghis Khan. Khutulun had spent decades resisting the authority of Kublai Khan, the founder of the Yuan dynasty. This resistance was not ideological but dynastic. Khutulun rejected Kublai's claim to supreme authority and fought to preserve the autonomy of the steppe-based Mongol tradition against the bureaucratic structures of China. His life unfolded in near-constant war, and his household reflected that reality. The environment of Khutulun's childhood was shaped by movement and readiness. Camps were temporary, horses were central to survival, and silence often preceded violence. Children learned to ride almost as soon as they could walk, not as ceremony but necessity. The steppe offered little margin for weakness. Winters were punishing, summers unforgiving, and distance itself functioned as an adversary. In such a world, capability mattered more than gender in daily survival, even if politics later attempted to impose limits. Within Khutulun's domain, loyalty was personal and tested continuously. Authority depended on visible strength, the ability to command warriors who followed not out of law but confidence. Failure invited defection. Success attracted rivals. Khutulun grew amid councils where strategy was debated in plain terms, where losses were accounted for without sentiment, and where power was understood as something temporary unless defended. This atmosphere did not produce exceptions. It produced competitors. The fragmentation of the empire intensified these pressures. Without a single khagan to arbitrate disputes, every regional ruler acted as both sovereign and insurgent. Warfare was not episodic but structural. Armies moved seasonally, alliances shifted through marriage or betrayal, and legitimacy was asserted through victory rather than proclamation. In this environment, the distinction between civilian and soldier blurred, especially within ruling families. Participation was expected, even if recognition was unevenly distributed. Khutulun's entry into this world did not announce itself as extraordinary. She was not born into prophecy or rebellion. She entered a system that rewarded competence and punished vulnerability, a system where identity was forged through action rather than declaration. The expectations placed upon her were clear, but so were the contradictions within them. She was raised to preserve lineage, yet lived in a culture that valued strength above inheritance. She was expected to submit to political necessity, yet witnessed authority earned through capability. The late 13th century Mongol world was therefore not a declining empire, but an unstable one. Its armies remained feared, its trade networks active, and its rulers formidable. Yet its cohesion had weakened, and its future depended on individuals navigating a landscape defined by rivalry and force. Khutulun's life would unfold within this tension, shaped by the weight of ancestry and the demands of survival. She did not emerge against the system, but from it, carrying the marks of an empire that still dominated the world even as it fractured from within. Khutulun was born into a world where ancestry was not memory but mechanism, an active force shaping authority, obligation, and danger. As a direct descendant of Genghis Khan through the line of Ogdi and Talyui, her blood placed her within the innermost circle of Mongol legitimacy. Lineage in the Mongol Empire was not symbolic. It determined who could command armies, arbitrate disputes, and claim the right to rule. Yet the same blood that granted access also imposed scrutiny, suspicion, and relentless political pressure, binding individual lives to dynastic calculation from birth. Within Mongol political culture, descent from Genghis Khan conferred a sacred legitimacy rooted in conquest and divine favor. The empire was held together not by bureaucracy alone, but by the belief that authority flowed through the Khan's lineage. Every descendant carried a fragment of that authority, but also embodied a potential challenge to others who shared it. Khutulun's family belonged to the branch descending from Ogdi's line, later overshadowed by Talyui's sons, whose descendants would dominate imperial succession. This imbalance made lineage both shield and vulnerability, especially for those outside the reigning branch. Inheritance among the Mongols was rarely linear. Although succession customs existed, they were flexible, shaped by consensus among elites, military strength, and personal reputation. Kurultais were convened to select leaders, but bloodline framed the limits of possibility. Only descendants of Genghis Khan could be considered, yet too many qualified candidates ensured conflict. For Khutulun's family, this meant constant negotiation between asserting legitimacy and avoiding elimination. Every marriage, alliance, and military role was weighed against how it might shift fragile balances within the ruling house. Khutulun grew within this atmosphere of inherited tension. Her father, Khaidu Khan, was himself a product of contested legitimacy, a powerful ruler who resisted the authority of Kublai Khan and the Yuan dynasty. Khaidu's claim rested on lineage and military autonomy rather than imperial recognition. For Khutulun, lineage was not abstract ancestry but daily reality, shaping where she traveled, whom she encountered, and how she was perceived. Her presence at court and on campaigns signaled continuity of Genghis Khan's blood outside Kublai's control. Bloodline also functioned as constraint. For male descendants, lineage demanded ambition, military leadership, and readiness to claim power. For women, it imposed expectations of strategic marriage, fertility, and alliance building. Khutulun's ancestry made her a valuable political asset, potentially transferable through marriage into rival houses. Every proposal carried consequences beyond personal union, threatening to dilute Khaidu's autonomy or strengthen opponents. Refusal was not merely personal defiance but a political act, preserving the integrity of her father's line in an environment where heirs could be absorbed by rivals. The disputes that fractured Mongol leadership were rarely ideological. They were rooted in inheritance, distribution of territory, and control of trade routes. Lineage justified claims but could not resolve them. As branches multiplied, authority thinned, and kinship became competition. Khutulun's lineage placed her near these fractures. She observed how cousins became adversaries and how shared ancestry failed to prevent violence. Loyalty was conditional, negotiated anew with each shift of power, making restraint as valuable as ambition. Within Kaidu's camp, lineage was leveraged to sustain resistance. His authority relied on presenting himself as a legitimate heir resisting illegitimate centralization. Khutulun's visibility reinforced this claim, embodying continuity of Genghis Khan's blood outside the Yuan court. Her participation in military life was not symbolic bravado but practical affirmation that Kaidu's house remained vital and capable. Yet this same visibility increased risk, marking her as a figure whose capture or marriage could destabilize the family's position. For Mongol women of noble blood, agency existed within limits set by inheritance politics. Khutulun's lineage granted her proximity to power but not freedom from its demands. Every action was interpreted through dynastic logic. Strength, discipline, and loyalty were not celebrated as personal virtues alone, but assessed for their impact on succession and alliance. Her choices reflected an acute awareness that lineage required preservation as much as assertion, especially for a family operating outside imperial favor. As conflicts between Kaidu and Kublai persisted, lineage hardened divisions rather than healing them. Appeals to shared descent failed against material interests and territorial control. Khutulun's blood connected her to the empire's founder, yet it also tied her to unresolved disputes that outlived individual lives. The authority she inherited was inseparable from instability, offering recognition without security. In this context, survival required careful calibration of visibility and restraint, strength and silence. Khutulun's lineage did not define her destiny alone, but it structured the field in which every decision occurred. Blood functioned as currency, weapon, and burden within Mongol rule, shaping the ambitions of men and the constraints of women alike. Inheritance disputes ensured that no claim was uncontested and no authority absolute. For those born closest to power, including Khutulun, lineage granted significance while denying certainty, binding personal life to the unresolved legacy of conquest. Khutulun's childhood unfolded not behind walls or silken screens, but across open grasslands where wind, dust, and distance shaped daily life. Born into a ruling lineage constantly on campaign, she moved with camps that rose and vanished with the seasons. Horses were present before memory, their smell and warmth as familiar as kin. Noise came not from court ritual but from hooves, leather, and shouted commands. Silence followed movement, stretching across the steppe at night. From the beginning, authority was experienced physically, through endurance, cold mornings, and the weight of survival carried by everyone, regardless of rank and inherited duty. Among Mongol families, childhood was preparation rather than protection. Sons and daughters absorbed skills through proximity, watching adults ride, hunt, argue, and decide. Khutulun learned balance by clinging to saddles, learned patience by wading through long rides, and learned fear without instruction. Steppe life offered little separation between play and training. Games mimicked combat, chores mirrored logistics, and mistakes carried immediate consequence. Royal birth altered status but not exposure. Elite children shared the same weather, risks, and expectations, ensuring that authority later exercised rested on familiarity with hardship rather than abstract command within their developing sense of self early on. Khutulun's upbringing reflected norms that valued capability over seclusion. Mongol society did not imagine childhood as fragile, especially among the ruling clans who depended on mobility and force. She witnessed councils where decisions were argued without ceremony and observed punishment administered without hesitation. Such scenes impressed restraint as much as power. Strength was respected, but control defined leadership. Watching elders weigh risks taught her that survival required judgment as much as courage. These lessons settled quietly, shaping instinct before conscious ambition emerged. They aligned her sense of self with collective endurance and expectation within Mongol political life structures broadly understood. Gender expectations on the steppe were rigid in outcome but flexible in method. Women were expected to support lineage continuity, yet the means varied according to circumstance. Khutulun trained alongside men because the environment demanded competence from all. Riding, archery, and wrestling were not statements but necessities. No ceremony marked her participation, nor did instruction carry ideological weight. Skills were transmitted because they worked. This practical neutrality allowed her abilities to develop without open challenge to custom, embedding exception within normality and reinforcing social cohesion rather than disruption within her community of nomadic aristocratic households across Central Asian territories broadly. Physical strain defined her formative years. Long rides numbed limbs, winter winds cracked skin, and injuries healed without indulgence. Khutulun learned limits through exhaustion rather than instruction. Pain was acknowledged briefly, then absorbed. Observing this discipline normalized endurance as currency. Authority belonged to those who could continue moving, fighting, and deciding despite discomfort. Such conditioning shaped her confidence later, not as defiance but as expectation. She belonged in motion, among warriors, because childhood had prepared her body and mind accordingly under conditions of scarcity, vigilance, and unrelenting seasonal uncertainty that governed nomadic survival across contested imperial frontiers consistently endured daily. Psychological formation accompanied physical training. Fear was neither dramatized nor denied. Children learned to manage it privately, observing adults who spoke little about risk yet prepared thoroughly. Khutulun internalized caution alongside boldness. She saw how rashness endangered groups and how patience preserved strength. These observations shaped restraint, an attribute prized in Mongol leadership. Her later composure emerged from early exposure to consequence, where mistakes threatened lives and resources, not reputation. Childhood thus functioned as quiet apprenticeship in responsibility within tightly bound communities dependent on collective survival and trust rather than individual expression or indulgent protection norms prevailing elsewhere historically then. Raised near decision-makers rather than isolated from them, Khutulun observed governance as lived practice. Disputes over grazing, loyalty, and command unfolded openly. She learned that authority required persuasion as often as force. Listening mattered. Silence during councils conveyed respect and calculation. These environments blurred distinctions between domestic and political life. Children absorbed strategy without formal teaching, simply by remaining present. Such exposure cultivated political awareness early, grounding ambition within collective interest rather than personal display and reinforcing continuity between household survival and imperial administration in Mongol aristocratic camps during prolonged periods of conflict, migration, negotiation, and consolidation phases overall. Khutulun's early years did not openly challenge gender norms because they operated within accepted structures. Steppe culture permitted competence where it served survival. Her skills emerged as extension of upbringing, not rebellion. By adulthood, her presence among warriors seemed unsurprising to those who had watched her grow. Childhood had already resolved the question of capability. What appeared exceptional later was rooted in ordinary practice. In this way, Mongol childhood norms quietly produced figures who could unsettle expectations without ever naming defiance through accumulated experience, necessity, and shared cultural logic shaped by environment, mobility, lineage, and continuous exposure to power realities. To understand Khutulun's rise, the structure that shaped every possibility around her must first be traced across the steppe, where Mongol warfare was not an institution separate from society but its organizing principle. Armies were not assembled from cities or conscripts but grew directly out of nomadic life. Movement, hunting, and seasonal migration doubled as training. From an early age, people learned distance by riding, timing by pursuit, and discipline by necessity. War did not interrupt life. It intensified habits already formed. In this environment, competence emerged visibly, measured in endurance, accuracy, and reliability rather than ceremony or inherited rank. The Mongol military system was built on units that mirrored social organization. Tens, hundreds, and thousands were arranged not merely for command efficiency but for accountability. Each man's survival depended on the cohesion of the group. Failure carried immediate cost, not abstract punishment. Desertion, hesitation, or incompetence endangered everyone and was treated accordingly. This created a ruthless clarity. Effectiveness mattered more than pedigree once the campaign began. While lineage granted access to command, it did not shield leaders from judgment in the field. Authority was constantly tested by conditions that spared no one, reinforcing a culture where skill validated position repeatedly. Merit within Mongol warfare was practical rather than ideological. Leaders rose because they could deliver results under pressure. Decisions were evaluated by outcome, not intention. A commander who failed lost followers quickly, sometimes violently. This environment cultivated a brutal honesty about capability. Even those born into ruling families were expected to demonstrate usefulness. Khutulun grew up observing this standard applied without apology. She saw men older and higher born dismissed or killed for errors, while others advanced through reliability and courage. The lesson was unmistakable. Survival of authority depended on performance, not claim alone. Battlefield competence required more than physical strength. Mongol warfare emphasized coordination across vast distances, demanding mental discipline and restraint. Riders moved quickly but not impulsively. Orders were simple, timing precise. Silence mattered. Waiting was often more dangerous than attacking. Khutulun's early exposure to this system showed her that success belonged to those who controlled fear and impatience. The environment rewarded calm under uncertainty. Leaders were expected to read terrain, weather, and enemy behavior, integrating instinct with collective movement. This emphasis shaped her understanding of power as something exercised through measured action rather than display. The meritocratic nature of the system did not imply equality. Hierarchies remained sharp, enforced through obedience and punishment. Yet within those hierarchies, opportunity existed for those who proved indispensable. This paradox defined Mongol warfare: ruthless discipline alongside fluid advancement. Khutulun's presence in this system was enabled by circumstance and necessity. Campaign life demanded participation from all capable members of elite households. She trained not because norms were challenged, but because the system absorbed ability wherever it appeared. Her competence became visible through repetition, not proclamation, aligning with the military's preference for results over rhetoric. Physical strain reinforced the system's values. Campaigns stretched across weeks of riding with minimal rest. Hunger, cold, and injury were expected conditions. Those who endured earned credibility. Khutulun's endurance placed her within this shared suffering, dissolving symbolic distance between her and male warriors. Trust formed through observation under stress. When someone continued riding despite exhaustion, or held position under threat, that reliability became known. In Mongol warfare, reputation traveled faster than orders. Competence established authority informally before it was acknowledged formally, a process Khutulun navigated by presence rather than demand. The system's ruthlessness lay also in its consequences. Failure did not end careers quietly. Units could be decimated, families punished, alliances broken. This severity created an environment where learning was accelerated and mistakes unforgiving. Khutulun learned to calculate risk carefully. Courage without discipline was not admired. Recklessness endangered formations and invited annihilation. The military rewarded those who balanced aggression with restraint. Such balance became central to her rise, aligning personal ability with institutional expectation. She did not stand outside the system but embodied its logic, allowing acceptance to follow demonstration rather than challenge. Titles within Mongol warfare carried weight only when reinforced by success. A noble without victories commanded little respect in the field. Conversely, proven leaders accumulated loyalty that translated into political leverage. This dynamic blurred military and political power. Khutulun's competence thus had implications beyond battle. Each demonstration strengthened her father's position and reinforced the legitimacy of their household. Her presence signaled vitality within Kaidu's camp, showing that his line produced capable leaders. The system converted battlefield effectiveness into political capital, making her role consequential even when unspoken. Understanding this structure clarifies why Khutulun's rise did not appear anomalous within her context. The Mongol military valued effectiveness above convention when survival was at stake. While gender norms shaped long-term expectations, immediate needs often overrode them. The system absorbed those who could contribute and marginalized those who could not. Khutulun's abilities aligned with its demands, allowing her to advance without overt rebellion. Her rise was not a rupture but a continuation of the system's internal logic, where competence carved space within rigid hierarchy. By the time her reputation solidified, it rested on repeated confirmation rather than exception. The Mongol military system had already tested and accepted her. Understanding this structure reveals that her ascent was less a challenge to tradition than an expression of it. The battlefield cared little for titles unsupported by ability. In that environment, inevitability belonged to those who endured, decided well, and delivered results. Khutulun's rise followed that path, shaped by a system that recognized competence wherever it proved indispensable. Khutulun's bond with her father took shape within a landscape defined by motion and opposition, where loyalty was tested not in words, but through shared endurance. Genghis Khan did not rule from a distant capital. His authority moved with his camp, carried across the steppe by riders who understood that resistance to Kublai Khan was not a single campaign but a condition of life. From childhood, Khutulun absorbed this reality. Her father's world was one of constant readiness, shaped by the knowledge that legitimacy was contested and survival depended on vigilance rather than ceremony. Kaidu's resistance to Kublai Khan was rooted in lineage and principle, but sustained through force. As a descendant of Ogdi, Kaidu rejected the dominance of Talui's line and the centralized rule imposed by Kublai from China. This was not rebellion in the modern sense but a struggle over the proper shape of Mongol authority. Kaidu believed that the empire's strength lay in the autonomy of its ruling houses and the traditions of the steppe, not in sedentary administration. His camps remained mobile, his power grounded in allegiance rather than bureaucracy, reinforcing a political identity defined by opposition. Within this environment, Khutulun's relationship with her father evolved through proximity rather than instruction. She rode with him, listened as plans were weighed, and observed how decisions balanced risk against necessity. Kaidu did not shield his children from conflict. He expected awareness and discipline from those around him, regardless of age or gender. Trust was not granted through affection alone but earned through reliability. Khutulun learned this early, understanding that closeness to power carried obligation. Her father's confidence in her grew not from indulgence but from repeated observation of her composure under strain. The civil struggle against Kublai was prolonged and exhausting. Campaigns stretched across years, punctuated by fragile truces and renewed conflict. Kaidu's forces fought across Central Asia, defending grazing lands, trade routes, and political autonomy. In these conditions, family and army overlapped. Khutulun was present not as a symbol but as a participant in the rhythms of war. She experienced the fatigue of long marches, the tension of waiting for engagement, and the quiet aftermath of loss. Shared hardship dissolved formal distance, allowing her role to shift gradually from daughter to companion. Kaidu's leadership style emphasized consultation and loyalty. He relied on trusted figures who could act decisively in fluid situations. As Khutulun demonstrated endurance and judgment, her father began to rely on her presence. This reliance was practical rather than ideological. She was there because she proved capable, because she understood his intent without explanation, and because she did not falter under pressure. In a conflict where betrayal was common and alliances unstable, familiarity became a strategic asset. Khutulun's constancy strengthened Kaidu's inner circle, reinforcing trust amid uncertainty. Psychologically, this relationship demanded restraint from both. Kaidu could not afford favoritism, nor could Khutulun expect exemption from risk. Their bond was shaped by mutual awareness of consequence. Each decision carried weight beyond personal outcome, affecting the legitimacy of their house and the morale of followers. Khutulun learned to suppress hesitation, not out of fearlessness but discipline. Kaidu, in turn, learned to treat her not as a protected heir but as a contributor whose actions affected the course of resistance. This recalibration unfolded gradually, without declaration. The Civil War sharpened Khutulun's understanding of imperial politics. She saw how Kublai's resources dwarfed their own, how centralized administration generated stability but diluted traditional authority. Kaidu's resistance was increasingly defensive, preserving autonomy rather than seeking conquest. Within this narrowing field, Every capable ally mattered. Khutulun's role expanded accordingly. Her presence on campaigns symbolized continuity and resolve, reinforcing the image of a ruling house still capable of producing leaders. Yet symbolism followed function. She was valued because she could endure the same conditions as seasoned warriors. Kaidu's trust manifested in proximity to danger. Khutulun rode near him in battle, shared councils where strategy was debated, and witnessed moments of doubt that rarely surfaced publicly. These experiences deepened her understanding of leadership as burden rather than privilege. She observed her father's fatigue, the weight of maintaining resistance across decades, and the isolation imposed by opposition to imperial authority. This exposure tempered ambition with realism. Khutulun did not romanticize power. She understood its cost through her father's example, shaping her own approach to authority as measured and grounded. As the struggle continued, Kaidu's reliance on Khutulun became visible to others. This visibility carried risk. It exposed her to scrutiny and potential targeting by rivals. Yet Kaidu did not retreat from this choice. The necessity of trust outweighed caution. In a fractured empire, bonds forged through shared survival were stronger than formal titles. Khutulun's role affirmed Kaidu's claim to legitimacy rooted in steppe tradition, demonstrating that his household remained cohesive and capable despite imperial pressure. By the later years of Kaidu's resistance, Khutulun's evolution was complete. She was no longer simply accompanying her father but acting within the same field of responsibility. Their relationship, forged through conflict, reflected the broader dynamics of Mongol rule, where family and power were inseparable. The civil struggle against Kublai Khan shaped them both, binding father and daughter through shared endurance. In this context, Khutulun's rise was not an anomaly but an extension of Kaidu's resistance, rooted in trust earned under the strain of contested imperial legitimacy. Khutulun's reputation did not emerge through proclamation or deliberate display but through repetition witnessed by many eyes. On the steppe, strength was not abstract. It was measured publicly, in contests where bodies met resistance and outcomes could not be negotiated. Wrestling and combat were embedded in Mongol life as expressions of readiness, discipline, and legitimacy. When Khutulun began to win consistently, it was not entertainment alone. Each victory registered within a cultural system that understood physical dominance as evidence of internal order, control, and fitness to command within a world shaped by force. Mongol wrestling was not sport separated from warfare. It was ritualized testing, stripped of armor and weapons but governed by the same values that ruled battle. Balance, patience, and awareness mattered more than brute power. Contests took place in open spaces, before assembled camps, without barriers or pretense. Loss was visible, undeniable. Khutulun's successes accumulated under these conditions. She defeated seasoned opponents not through spectacle but through control, absorbing force and redirecting it. Observers recognized technique shaped by experience rather than novelty. Her victories were quiet but decisive, reinforcing credibility through consistency. Public strength functioned as political capital because it created shared knowledge. Those who witnessed a contest carried its outcome into future interactions. Reputation traveled through camps and trade routes, repeated by those who had seen her stand unbroken while others fell. This circulation mattered in a society where trust preceded alliance. Khutulun's strength signaled reliability. It suggested she could endure hardship, impose order, and protect those aligned with her household. In Mongol culture, such signals mattered as much as lineage because they addressed immediate concerns of survival and leadership. Her feats unsettled rivals because they disrupted expectation without violating custom. Wrestling allowed women to participate in certain contexts, yet dominance remained rare. Khutulun's victories forced recalibration. Rivals could not dismiss her without dismissing the system that validated strength openly. To challenge her legitimacy would require challenging the cultural framework that honored visible competence. This created unease. Her presence complicated calculations, introducing an element that could not be easily neutralized through marriage or dismissal. Strength earned publicly resisted quiet absorption into existing hierarchies. Allies, too, felt discomfort. Khutulun's reputation reflected on her father's household, amplifying its standing. Those aligned with Khutulun gained prestige through association but also risk. Visibility attracted attention. Her victories announced vitality within a family resisting imperial authority. This could invite support but also retaliation. Allies had to consider whether proximity strengthened or endangered their position. Khutulun's strength thus functioned ambivalently, offering reassurance while heightening stakes. It bound observers into a shared awareness that power remained contested and dynamic. Psychologically, Khutulun's approach to these contests revealed restraint rather than hunger for acclaim. She did not perform for spectacle. Her demeanor remained controlled, her movements economical. Winning did not produce celebration, and loss, when it occurred, did not provoke excuse. This composure reinforced perception of discipline. Observers saw not defiance but confidence shaped by training and expectation. Her motivation appeared aligned with household interest rather than personal fame. Strength served purpose, reinforcing stability within Kaidu's camp rather than challenging authority directly. Combat beyond wrestling further cemented her reputation. Participation in skirmishes and defensive actions exposed her to risk alongside male warriors. Success in these contexts confirmed that her strength translated beyond ritualized space. She could ride, strike, and endure. Each confirmation expanded the scope of her credibility. Reputation deepened through accumulation, not singular triumph. Mongol culture valued sustained performance over isolated feats. Khutulun's consistency aligned with this valuation, making her difficult to categorize as anomaly or novelty. The symbolic weight of her victories extended into marriage politics. In Mongol society, physical contests often preceded unions, testing suitability and alliance strength. Khutulun's refusal to yield easily transformed these customs. Strength became a barrier rather than bridge, delaying absorption into another lineage. This unsettled both rivals seeking advantage and allies hoping to deploy her strategically. Her reputation thus interfered with established mechanisms of political consolidation, not through declaration but through fact. No negotiation could ignore her demonstrated capability. Environmental context amplified these effects. Contests occurred against the backdrop of open steppe, under weather that exposed endurance. Wind, dust, and uneven ground removed artificial advantage. Victory under such conditions carried authenticity. Khutulun's body bore the marks of training and exposure, signaling participation in the same hardships as others. This visibility mattered. Authority in Mongol culture rested on shared experience of strain. Her strength suggested not exemption but inclusion, reinforcing trust among those who valued endurance as proof of commitment. As stories of her victories spread, they merged with broader narratives of Kaidu's resistance. Khutulun became associated with persistence against imperial consolidation. Her strength symbolized continuity of steppe values amid pressure from centralized rule. This symbolism was not crafted but inferred. Observers connected physical dominance with political resolve. Such associations unsettled Kublai's supporters, who framed legitimacy through administration and lineage rather than visible martial competence. Khutulun's reputation thus intersected with ideological conflict without explicit articulation. By the time her name circulated widely, it carried layered meaning. She was known not only as Kaidu's daughter but as a figure whose strength had been tested publicly and repeatedly. This reputation constrained responses. Rivals hesitated, allies recalculated, and observers watched carefully. Public strength had become political capital, earned through exposure and endurance. Khutulun did not announce her rise. It unfolded inevitably through victories that could not be undone, shaping perception and possibility within a culture where what was seen and survived carried lasting weight. What began as visible competence hardened, over time, into something more consequential. Khutulun's presence on campaigns ceased to be noted as unusual and instead became operationally necessary. In Mongol warfare, where survival depended on coordination rather than hierarchy alone, reliability altered relationships more than titles ever could. She was no longer assessed as a demonstration of strength but as a constant within the moving machinery of war. Orders accounted for her position. Plans assumed her participation. This quiet shift marked the point where personal prowess began translating into institutional influence. Battlefield reliability in the Mongol system was measured by consistency under strain. Khutulun showed this not through dramatic intervention but through repetition. She arrived when expected, held positions assigned, and executed tasks without embellishment. In moments of confusion, she responded without hesitation. Such predictability carried weight. Commanders learned they could build plans around her presence without adjustment. Trust formed not from admiration but from absence of doubt. Over time, this trust recalibrated how male leaders spoke to her, consulted her, and positioned her with informations. The environment reinforced this transformation. Campaigns unfolded across vast distances where error multiplied quickly. Wind obscured signals, dust reduced visibility, and fatigue slowed reaction. In such conditions, commanders relied on individuals who did not require supervision. Khutulun became one of these figures. Her understanding of terrain, timing, and collective movement reduced friction within operations. She did not need constant instruction. This autonomy distinguished her from less reliable nobles whose lineage outweighed their performance. Authority followed those who reduced uncertainty, and Khutulun consistently did so. Psychologically, this shift required restraint on her part. Command authority in Mongol culture was exercised carefully. Overassertion invited resistance. Khutulun did not seek to command through declaration. She allowed authority to accrue through necessity. When asked for input, she spoke concisely. When assigned responsibility, she fulfilled it without spectacle. This discipline prevented backlash. Male leaders accustomed to dominance could accept her influence because it did not threaten their status overtly. It functioned within existing norms while subtly reshaping them. Interactions within councils reflected this change. Initially present as observer, Khutulun gradually became a participant. Her silence carried meaning because it was informed. When she spoke, it addressed practical concerns. Routes, timing, readiness. These contributions aligned with the priorities of commanders managing limited resources against a stronger imperial opponent. Over time, her assessments were anticipated. Leaders adjusted plans based on her experience. This consultation did not come with formal rank, but it altered decision-making patterns in ways that mattered more than title. Institutional influence in Mongol power structures often emerged through proximity to execution rather than theory. Those who carried out orders shaped how future orders were written. Khutulun's reliability influenced the scope of tasks assigned to her. She was entrusted with guarding key positions, coordinating movements, and maintaining cohesion during withdrawal. Each successful execution expanded the range of responsibilities deemed appropriate. Male leaders adjusted their expectations accordingly, recalibrating assumptions about who could be entrusted with what under pressure. Physical presence reinforced authority. Khutulun bore the same exhaustion as others. Her body carried the marks of riding, combat, and exposure. This shared strain mattered. Authority divorced from hardship was resented. By enduring alongside her peers, she removed a common source of resistance. Her commands, when given, did not feel imposed from above but emerged from within the group's shared experience. This alignment with collective suffering legitimized her influence more effectively than formal elevation ever could. Fear also played a role, though it remained unspoken. Khutulun's reputation meant that opposition carried risk. Those who challenged her judgment did so knowing her competence was publicly established. Failure against her carried reputational cost. This dynamic discouraged casual dismissal. Male leaders accustomed to contesting authority weighed their responses carefully. Over time, deference became habitual. Not submission, but acknowledgement of capability. This subtle psychological shift altered power relations without provoking open conflict. Historical causality underpinned this process. Genghis Khan's prolonged resistance to Kublai required efficient use of limited resources. He could not afford to sideline capable individuals. Khutulun's reliability aligned with this necessity. As pressure intensified, competence outweighed convention. Each year of resistance narrowed tolerance for inefficiency. In this environment, institutional adaptation occurred organically. Command structures bent to accommodate effectiveness wherever it appeared. Khutulun's influence grew not because norms were overturned, but because survival demanded flexibility. Her evolving authority also affected how others positioned themselves around her. Allies sought coordination. Subordinates followed direction without question when it came through her. This network of interactions reinforced her standing. Authority in Mongol systems was relational, built through patterns of response. Khutulun's role became embedded within these patterns. Removing her would have disrupted operations. This indispensability marked the transition from individual excellence to institutional relevance. Importantly, this shift did not erase constraints. Khutulun remained embedded within a patriarchal structure that limited formal recognition. Yet within those limits, her influence was real and measurable. Male leaders adjusted their behavior not out of ideology but pragmatism. They accounted for her competence as they would any reliable commander. This normalization represented the deepest form of acceptance. She was no longer exceptional. She was functional. As campaigns continued, this altered dynamic stabilized. New participants encountered Khutulun already positioned within command routines. They adapted accordingly. Institutional memory absorbed her presence. Over time, the origin of her authority mattered less than its effect. Orders flowed through her, coordination relied on her, and outcomes reflected her decisions. The transformation was complete not when she was acknowledged publicly, but when operations assumed her role without question. What began as personal prowess thus reshaped interaction within Mongol power structures. Khutulun's battlefield reliability translated into command authority through accumulation rather than declaration. Male leaders adjusted because effectiveness required it. The system absorbed her influence as it absorbed all that proved necessary. In this way, her rise followed the internal logic of Mongol governance, where authority emerged from function and survival determined legitimacy. Marriage proposals arrived not as personal overtures but as instruments, carried by envoys who spoke carefully and listened for hesitation. In Mongol aristocratic culture, marriage was a mechanism of alignment, a means of redistributing loyalty and stabilizing contested power. For Khutulun, these proposals marked a threshold. Until then, her strength and authority had been absorbed as functional necessities within warfare. Marriage forced a different reckoning, one that tested the limits of tolerance within a system willing to accommodate competence but resistant to autonomy that could not be transferred or contained. The proposals reflected calculation rather than desire. Each offered alliance, security, or recognition, binding Khutulun's lineage to another house through sanctioned exchange. Such unions were common, expected, and often decisive in resolving rivalries. Acceptance would have transformed her authority into symbolic capital, folded into a broader network controlled by men whose power derived from consolidation rather than endurance. Refusal disrupted this process. It delayed resolution, introduced uncertainty, and challenged assumptions about how power should be distributed through family structures. Khutulun's refusals were not delivered with provocation. They were firm, measured, and grounded in precedent of capability rather than ideology. She did not reject marriage itself but the terms under which it was offered. In doing so, she preserved control over her own position within her father's household and the military structure she had earned through reliability. This distinction mattered. She did not step outside custom entirely, but she resisted being reduced to a conduit for alliance, insisting that her value could not be transferred without consequence. These refusals unsettled elites because they exposed an unresolved question. If Khutulun's power was merely symbolic, then her resistance could be overridden. If it was real, then forcing compliance risked destabilizing the balance within Kaidu's camp and beyond. Elites accustomed to negotiating through marriage found themselves confronting a figure whose authority did not depend on future promise but on proven function. This challenged the logic of alliance-making, which assumed that influence could always be redistributed through kinship. The environment in which these negotiations unfolded amplified their tension. Camps shifted with the seasons. Councils convened amid travel and preparation for conflict. Decisions were made under pressure, not leisure. Khutulun's presence in these spaces was already normalized as operational. Removing her through marriage would have created immediate gaps. Those gaps were visible to commanders who relied on her. Thus, proposals carried practical implications beyond diplomacy. Acceptance or refusal altered readiness, not just lineage. Psychologically, Khutulun navigated these moments with restraint shaped by years of discipline. She understood the risks of isolation and the danger of appearing inflexible. Yet she also recognized the fragility of authority that depended on concession. Yielding would have reframed her achievements as provisional, contingent on male guardianship. Her refusals preserved continuity between her established role and future possibility. They were acts of maintenance rather than rebellion, aimed at sustaining function within a volatile system. Genghis Khan's position complicated matters further. As a leader resisting imperial consolidation, he relied on alliances but also on internal cohesion. Forcing his daughter into marriage risked weakening the very structure that sustained resistance. Her reliability had become integral to his operations. Thus, proposals forced Kaidu to weigh traditional alliance building against immediate strategic necessity. His tolerance of her refusals signaled recognition of her tangible value. It also broadcast to others that her authority carried his protection, reinforcing its reality. Rivals interpreted these developments cautiously. Some saw opportunity in disruption, hoping refusal would isolate Khutulun and weaken her household. Others recognized that her stance indicated strength not easily neutralized. Allies recalculated their positions, unsure whether association would bring stability or invite scrutiny. The ambiguity of her power unsettled established patterns. It resisted categorization as purely symbolic or purely familial. It occupied a space shaped by performance, trust, and necessity. The cultural symbolism of marriage intensified scrutiny. Mongol society tolerated female competence when it served collective survival, but long-term autonomy challenged inheritance norms. Khutulun's refusals forced elites to confront this boundary. Could a woman retain power independent of marital exchange without fracturing social order? The question was not debated openly, but it lingered within decisions and delays. Each unanswered proposal prolonged uncertainty, making visible the limits of accommodation within a system otherwise flexible under pressure. Sensory details of these encounters reinforced their gravity. Negotiations occurred amid the sounds of camp life, the creak of saddles, the murmur of councils, the constant readiness for movement. There was no private chamber where decisions could be isolated from consequence. Refusals echoed outward, carried by messengers who repeated words across distances. Each repetition hardened perception. Khutulun's stance became known not through proclamation but through absence of agreement. Over time, the accumulation of refusals altered expectations. Proposals diminished or shifted tone. Some sought compromise, others withdrew. The process clarified the nature of her power. Could not be easily absorbed or exchanged. It demanded recognition on its own terms. This realization did not dismantle the marriage system, but it carved an exception sustained by circumstance. Khutulun's authority remained contingent, but it was no longer dismissible. By the chapter's end, the question confronting elites was no longer whether she would marry, but how to engage a figure whose power resisted conventional channels. Her refusals did not resolve tension. They redistributed it. Alliances remained unsettled, calculations incomplete. Yet within this instability, clarity emerged. Khutulun's power was real because it produced consequence. It altered decisions, delayed agreements, and reshaped interaction. In a system defined by utility, that effect alone confirmed its substance. Khutulun's authority moved gradually from presence to direction, a shift marked less by announcement than by the quiet redistribution of responsibility. What had once been reliance on her reliability now became expectation of her judgment. She was entrusted not only to execute plans but to shape them. In the Mongol world, where command flowed from necessity rather than doctrine, this transition reflected changing realities on the ground. Campaigns stretched resources thin, enemies adapted, and survival demanded clarity. Within this pressure, Khutulun's role expanded naturally, even as it unsettled assumptions held by those accustomed to fixed hierarchies. Command in Mongol warfare was situational, defined by who could see clearly in moments of confusion. Khutulun demonstrated this ability repeatedly. She read terrain with the intuition of someone shaped by movement rather than maps. She understood when to press forward and when to hold, how fatigue altered timing, how fear spread through ranks if left unaddressed. These insights were not theoretical. They came from years of riding at the edge of formations, absorbing the rhythms of advance and retreat. When she began issuing instructions, they aligned seamlessly with the needs of the moment. Troops responded to this clarity. Orders delivered without hesitation carried authority, regardless of source. Soldiers accustomed to harsh conditions valued leaders who minimized uncertainty. Khutulun's commands were concise, grounded in shared experience. She did not invoke lineage or status. Her authority rested on familiarity with strain. This resonated with fighters whose loyalty was earned through survival rather than obligation. Their response reinforced her position, creating a feedback loop where obedience validated command, and command structured further obedience. Yet within elite circles, discomfort grew. Mongol norms allowed flexibility in crisis, but long-term leadership was expected to conform to established patterns. Khutulun's active command blurred these boundaries. Her presence in strategic councils shifted dynamics. She spoke from experience rather than abstraction, addressing logistics, morale, and timing. Some leaders welcomed this pragmatism. Others felt their authority eroded subtly, without confrontation. The tension was rarely voiced openly. It manifested in pauses, in careful phrasing, in glances exchanged when she spoke. Psychologically, Khutulun navigated this terrain with restraint. She understood the fragility of acceptance. Overassertion would provoke resistance, yet withdrawal would weaken effectiveness. She calibrated her involvement carefully, offering counsel when needed, remaining silent when intervention would inflame sensitivities. This discipline reflected deep understanding of power as relational rather than absolute. Her ambition, if present, was contained within responsibility. She sought function, not recognition. This orientation preserved stability even as it challenged norms. Strategic advising intensified this tension. Khutulun's proximity to Genghis Khan placed her near the center of decision-making. She observed patterns of enemy movement, shifts in alliance, and the psychological state of their own forces. When she offered assessment, it was grounded in observation rather than speculation. These contributions improved outcomes, reinforcing her value. Yet they also highlighted the inadequacy of some established leaders whose authority rested on lineage more than insight. Comparison was unavoidable, and comparison bred unease. The environment amplified these dynamics. Councils convened in camps exposed to wind and dust, without walls to separate ranks. Decisions were made under threat of immediate consequence. There was no space for ceremony to soften disruption. Khutulun's voice carried alongside others, measured by utility alone. This setting stripped authority to its essentials. Those uncomfortable with her leadership had little recourse but patience. Survival outweighed pride, at least temporarily. Cultural norms strained under this pressure. Mongol society valued adaptability, yet it also relied on inheritance to maintain continuity. Khutulun's command unsettled this balance. She did not reject tradition, but she occupied space not fully anticipated by it. Elites struggled to reconcile her effectiveness with expectations of gendered authority. Some rationalized her role as extension of her father's will. Others framed it as temporary necessity. Few confronted its implications directly. The system absorbed tension without resolving it. Troops, less burdened by abstract norms, adapted more readily. Their loyalty followed outcomes. When Khutulun's decisions led to survival or advantage, acceptance deepened. Over time, her leadership became part of operational routine. New recruits encountered her already positioned within command structures. They learned to respond accordingly. This normalization contrasted sharply with elite discomfort, widening the gap between functional authority and formal recognition. Fear underlay much of the resistance. Khutulun's competence exposed vulnerabilities. Leaders who relied on inherited status feared comparison. Her presence threatened to recalibrate standards of legitimacy. If effectiveness outweighed tradition, long-standing hierarchies could erode. This anxiety manifested subtly, through cautious support rather than outright opposition. The discomfort was structural, not personal. Khutulun represented a shift the system could not easily articulate. Historical causality framed these developments. Kaidu's resistance to Kublai Khan intensified pressure on leadership structures. Prolonged conflict rewarded innovation and punished rigidity. Under these conditions, Khutulun's leadership was not indulgence but adaptation. The system bent to accommodate survival. Norms stretched without breaking, but the strain was evident. Each successful command extended the gap between what was accepted in practice and what was acknowledged in principle. Khutulun remained aware of this gap. Her conduct reflected caution shaped by foresight. She did not demand titles or formal acknowledgement. She allowed authority to remain situational, embedded in action. This limited backlash while preserving effectiveness. Her restraint was strategic, protecting her position within an environment still negotiating its limits. Leadership, for her, was not an end but a function of responsibility. By the chapter's close, Khutulun's role had expanded irreversibly. She commanded troops, advised strategy, and shaped outcomes. Acceptance among elites remained incomplete, shadowed by discomfort and uncertainty. Yet her leadership endured because it answered immediate needs. Kaidu's resistance to Kublai Khan had endured through adaptability and personal resolve, but age narrowed the margin for improvisation. He no longer rode at the edge of every engagement, and his absence from certain movements was quietly noted. Authority remained his, yet execution shifted toward those he trusted implicitly. Khutulun was among them, not because of sentiment, but because her reliability reduced uncertainty. What had once been delegated sparingly was now entrusted by necessity, and this transfer reshaped how others measured influence within the camp. With Kaidu's advancing age came renewed attention to succession, a subject long avoided yet never absent. Among Mongol elites, succession was not a fixed line but a negotiation shaped by capability, loyalty, and survival. Khutulun entered these discussions not as a candidate in name but as a force whose presence altered calculations. Her authority no longer depended on her father's proximity. It rested on the demonstrated fact that operations continued smoothly under her guidance, a reality no debate could ignore. Psychologically, this shift demanded a recalibration from Khutulun herself. She understood the danger of appearing to reach beyond custom, yet she also recognized the cost of hesitation. Responsibility pressed inward, carrying the weight of lives and alliances. Her decisions became more deliberate, her restraint more visible. She spoke less often, but when she did, her words were shaped by consequence rather than assertion. Authority in this phase was maintained through control of impulse as much as command. Elite discomfort intensified as Khutulun's indispensability became apparent. Leaders accustomed to inherited authority found themselves adjusting to a reality where effectiveness dictated precedence. Councils subtly reoriented around her assessments, and strategic debates shifted tone when she spoke. This influence was not formalized, yet it shaped outcomes. Some resisted quietly, others adapted, but none could deny that Kaidu's camp now depended on her continuity as much as his name. The environment of prolonged resistance magnified the importance of this transition. Resources were limited, alliances fragile, and the margin for error narrow. Khutulun coordinated movements, evaluated readiness, and managed loyalty through presence rather than decree. Her authority functioned laterally, binding units through trust earned in shared hardship. Soldiers recognized her as a stabilizing force, one who reduced chaos rather than amplified it. This perception reinforced her role at the center of strategic planning. Succession debates sharpened as Kaidu's health declined further. Names were weighed, alliances tested, and futures imagined against uncertain horizons. Khutulun's influence shaped these conversations indirectly. Her capacity to maintain cohesion made certain outcomes viable and others untenable. Those who dismissed her authority found their arguments weakened by practical dependency. Her role exposed a truth often avoided. Leadership within Mongol systems ultimately rested on who could sustain function under strain. Kaidu's trust in Khutulun, once pragmatic, became explicit in moments of fatigue. He deferred where he once decided alone, allowing her judgment to guide immediate action. This was not abdication but acknowledgement. His authority persisted, yet its expression changed. Through this transition, Khutulun's power separated from derivation. It no longer flowed from proximity to her father, but from the structure she helped hold together. Elite circles struggled to reconcile this reality with inherited frameworks. Some attempted to frame her influence as temporary, bound to Kaidu's lifetime. Others sought accommodation, aligning themselves with her out of calculation rather than conviction. These responses revealed the strain within Mongol political culture as it confronted a figure whose authority had emerged organically. Khutulun did not seek to resolve this tension. She operated within it, prioritizing continuity over validation. Sensory details of this period underscored the gravity of transition. Kaidu's movements slowed, his posture stiffened by age and injury. Khutulun compensated, riding longer distances, remaining visible among troops, maintaining rhythm. Nights were colder, councils quieter. The burden of anticipation pressed into every decision. These conditions demanded leadership grounded in endurance rather than ambition, reinforcing her essential role as the axis around which action turned. By this stage, succession was inseparable from her continued participation. Strategies were evaluated based on whether she could support them, territories assessed by their capacity to remain loyal under her coordination. This practical dependence marked the peak of her political weight. Authority had become structural. Even those who resisted her influence operated within parameters she helped define, acknowledging her indispensability through their calculations. The turning point was not announced, but recognized through changed behavior. Decisions awaited her return, movements paused until her assessment arrived. Kaidu's name still carried weight, but its execution passed increasingly through her hands. This was the culmination of years of accumulated trust. Her authority, once derivative, had become essential, shaping the future not through claim but through sustained function. In this phase, Khutulun stood not as symbol or exception, but as a stabilizing force within an aging resistance. Her authority reflected adaptation under pressure, a response to time, fatigue, and necessity. As Kaidu's era approached its close, the structures she reinforced would determine what endured beyond him. The chapter ends not in uncertainty, but in recognition of a transformation completed through consequence. This outcome followed historical logic rather than design. Steppe politics rewarded those who sustained cohesion when certainty failed. Khutulun's rise answered that demand. Her authority was essential because it worked, because it held together what age and conflict threatened to dissolve. In that sense, her power was neither borrowed nor proclaimed, but earned through the quiet mathematics of survival. Its permanence rested on function, not memory, and would shape decisions long after Kaidu's voice fell silent within Mongol political life.